Tomorrow.
All right. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today thank you for joining us for yesterday's event, and welcome back to day 2 of the 2021 International Conference on Student Development in Higher Education. My name is Alyssa Mohammed from the Kuliah of Economics and Management Sciences of IIUM, and I am honored to be both the Master of Ceremonies and the Chair, along with my fellow timekeeper, Mina, for tonight. Therefore, I'd like to welcome you all to the final event of our conference, the second presidential debate of the 2021 ICSDHE. So the motion for tonight's discussion is this House would decentralize education policy away from central governments towards local authorities. As I'd mentioned in the previous debate, a couple of House rules to note are that 1, the format of this debate will be similar to an American-style Lincoln-Douglas debate. Therefore, we will have 2 speakers on the affirmative and negative benches each. Each speaker will only be able to speak for about 7 minutes. And within those 7 minutes, 2 bells will ring during each speech. The first bell will ring at the 6th minute to denote that the speaker has 1 minute left. And the second bell will ring at the 7th minute to denote that the speaker's time is up. Mina, if you're online, can we test the bell?
All right, give me a moment.
Okay, you all heard that, right? Because yesterday we had problems with the bell, so just wanted to test it out again. No POIs are going to be made during the speeches, as there's going to be a 10-minute discussion period that has been allocated for the speakers to rebut each other's cases. About this 10-minute discussion period, each bench will have 1 speaker do a 5-minute reply speech. And in that 5-minute reply speech, there will be 1 bell to denote that your time is up. So basically the bell will ring at the 5th minute. If it exceeds, it will also continue to ring at the 6th minute, so on and so forth. Now, for the second thing that I'd like to note, it's that we ask all the members of the audience to please leave your mics on mute so that the speakers may be audible to everyone throughout the debate. A 15-minute Q&A session will commence after the speaker's discussion period. So the flow is basically all the speakers do their speeches, then it's the reply speeches, and then it's a Q&A session. So it will commence after the speaker's discussion period to open the floor for any questions from the audience about the debate and the cases presented. During this period, questions will be taken from both the Zoom chat and from the chat on our YouTube live stream. Hence, feel free to type up any questions you have throughout the debate on either of these platforms, so that way I may direct them to the speakers accordingly. As well as that, do remember to include which speaker you'd like to address your question to in order to avoid any confusion in the discussion. And if there is no particular speaker that you'd like to address that question to, at least put in which bench you'd like to ask. Now, to introduce the speakers of this session, on affirmative, we have our very own Mubarak Wasi of Malaysia from IIUM. He was a 3-time Asian champion, 3-time Asian best speaker, first Asian to be Cambridge InterVarsity Open champion and best speaker, and part of the first and only Asian team to win Australasians in its 45-year history. Today, he works as a debate educator in Qatar, helping to spread the culture of open dialogue and discussion in the Arab world and beyond, and coaches the national team of Qatar, leading the nation to the knockout stages of the World Championships for the first time in their history. So yeah, very extensive CV he has here. Also on affirmative, we have Muhammad Ilham Akbar of Indonesia from the Institute of Technology Bandung. He is currently pursuing his master's degree in architectural research, focusing on inclusive and universal design for disabled communities. He is a competitive debater and has won and adjudicated various prestigious international and national debating competitions, such as winning the English as a foreign language category of the World's University Debating Championship and IIUM Open 2019. Aside from researching and debating, he is involved in local social-political movements in education, such as street children education and special education for the blind and visually impaired. He believes that including local, disabled, and marginalized communities in shaping our education will build and built environment will universally benefit us all. Very inclusive guy. So on the negative side, we have Josh Ashworth of the United Kingdom from the London School of Economics. He was half of the 11th best team in Europe at the European Debating Championships in 2018 and broke to partial quarters at the World Championships in 2020. He has won tournaments globally, such as Krakow in Poland, where he was top speaker, the UK's Durham InterVarsity and King's College London InterVarsity Pro-Am, the International Sports Open, and BAC Pre-Australs. In his last debate tournament at university, he was top speaker at Monash Malaysia Online 2020. He now works as a public servant based at the Department of Business, Energy, and Industrial Strategy in Westminster, and volunteers with Young Diverse World Changers, which is a social enterprise focused on increasing social mobility, and Outbreak, which is another youth organization in his local community. Also on the negative side, we have Moriam Jahan Saima of Bangladesh from Chittagong University. She is currently pursuing her bachelor's in human resource management, so sounds like me, also majoring in management. And being passionate about debating, a big part of her undergraduate life has been dedicated to debate. So with a continuation to that now, she is currently assuming a position as General Secretary in the Chittagong University Debating Society. So clearly, all four of these speakers have very extensive experience in debating. Really look forward to what's going to happen in a little bit. Therefore, without further ado, Mina, I'm just scared. Can you test the bell again?
Okay.
Thanks. Okay, cool. Without further ado, I'd now like to call upon the first affirmative speaker to begin the debate. Speaker, whenever you're ready.
I'm assuming I'm audible and visible. Thank you, Alyssa, and a warm welcome to Josh, Saima, and Dilham as well. Even though I'm no longer in IIM, I feel like I am. Okay, so I think I'll say a couple of things. Firstly is just a quick note is that if anyone doesn't know who I am, I used to be that guy who used to team up with Syed Sadiq, so the less good looking version of them. So, all right, let's get to it. I'm gonna, talk about four things. I'm gonna talk about why do we think that education needs to be decentralized in terms of like, why do we think the governing systems are better when it's decentralized? I'm gonna talk about why is it that we are able to hold local governments more accountable than federal governments or central governments? I'm going to talk about why standardization is a bad idea in general for the country. And fourthly, I'll talk about why is it that we are likely to get more kids educated when it comes to developing countries and rural kids and so on and so on. But before I get into it, I just want to tell like a very simple story. I think many of you who are in IIUM or in Malaysia may be aware of it. When the COVID pandemic started, what IIUM did was they shut down, right? Just like the rest of the country in Malaysia. And what happened was the foreign students were told that, since you guys are living here, you don't get to leave the campus, so you just stay here. While local students were allowed to leave, obviously because they have families outside, so they had to travel in and outside campus. Now, when things started slowly opening up and mosques started opening, the central government decided that the policy would be that foreigners would not be allowed to get into mosques. For whatever reason, they thought foreigners are more exposed to the COVID-19 pandemic. But regardless of what you thought of that policy, think about what that meant in IIUM. Think about the fact that locals in IIUM mosque were allowed to go in, but foreign kids were not. Even though by IIUM's policy, it was the foreign students who were the least exposed to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, whatever you think of the central policy, what is true for sure is that it didn't apply to the context of IIUM. And that is systemic and endemic to what happens when central governments make decisions for everyone without thinking of the different contexts that exist in countries. And that is the central point we make today from Side Affirmative. So, who is better at making decisions? We would suggest that the more people there are, the more diverse the country is, and the larger the country gets, it becomes harder and harder for central governments to make effective decisions for people, especially when it comes to education policy. Why is this the case? Because firstly, in terms of just logistically speaking, right? So for example, if you're the federal government of Malaysia sitting there, does it make sense for you when you're making a central syllabus for everyone to go ahead and say, I'm going to enforce learning of the IBAN language, for example? It doesn't, because even logistically speaking, you couldn't ensure amount of teachers in every single public school. Whereas if it was decentralized and you allowed, let's say, the Eastern Malaysian government to be making certain decisions for themselves, that is something they could logistically do, and that could be something that could be incorporated in the first place. So we have catering towards context and minority communities more likely to be happening in our world. We're happy, of course, for central governments to make basic syllabuses like English, math, and that kind of stuff. But we would suggest, and even like some basic tests, but we would say the vast majority of the syllabus, tests, everything should be done as much as possible by decentralized communities. We're happy to give them money to be able to make their own decisions. We're happy to empower local teachers unions and so on and so forth. Now, what I would say here is that this doesn't apply to just languages, right? Because even though that's a really important thing, in terms of how many, for example, like street schools do you need to teach street children, right? Night schools for schools for children, for example. What community needs more of those to be able to teach those kids in a particular neighborhood? Which kind of kids respond to what is really different based on the area, the context that it belongs to? And for example, even vocational schools, right? So for example, some areas are better off teaching certain vocational skills to kids in that particular neighborhood that maybe in a centralized syllabus or a centralized system doesn't make as much sense. So those are decisions that the central government simply can't take. But what we would suggest is it actually is more insidious. Sometimes it's not just logistics or the inability to make decisions, but also the way in which things are set up. The way in which things are set up makes it less likely that meaningful representation happens from minority communities, from rural communities, right? So if you're thinking of a federal government coming to power and making decisions, like, how likely is it that they're going to have a meaningful minority representation over there to be able to say that these are the things we need over there? At best, they will probably have like one super rich businessman from that community. Whereas if it's a local government, the ability to have that representation is significantly easier, right? So that's why ending up, we find that our system ends up creating more accommodation for the different needs of communities when it comes to, defending their languages or preserving cultural aspects and so on and so forth that we just talked about. Second, in terms of accountability, right? So like, okay, of course, systems can mess up, but how do you hold governments accountable? We would suggest that local governments are far easier to hold accountable. It's easier to vote them out, and your single vote has a lot more power, right? Because there's a smaller community, so your vote makes a bigger difference there. And that's why they're more likely to listen to you when you call them, for example, on their phones. Like, it's also like, they're also often local people. You can literally know the person over there. You have access to them. Like, it's easier to protest. You can literally pick at the guy's house, like if they live down the street, but compare it to a central government. Like, I think Malaysians for the last few years know more than anyone that a vote does not make much of a difference, unfortunately, when it comes to the mainstream politics and federal politicians trying to hold on to power. They don't really care as much, and it's harder to hold them to account because they can use the power over the media to deflect on issues. It's also like if your rural area is facing an issue, it's really hard for you to go to a KL central government to be able to make a difference over there, right? So we think it's making those kind of differences is really, really difficult, right? And governments have a lot of ways in which to evade this accountability. Now, what I would say thirdly is that the standardization concept, which I'm sure opposition will say creates job opportunities for people and so on and so forth, is actually kind of bad. Because the more you standardize, the harder it is for rural kids to actually be able to get more opportunities, we would actually suggest. Why is this the case? I don't think it's 7 yet, it's 6:30. Why is this the case? Because we would suggest that when you make a centralized platform, when urban elites make these curricula, for example, that often means that it is something that urban kids find more familiar with, subjects, for example, that are more easier for them. As a consequence, it often leads to situations where rural kids who are less privileged also score far lower, and actually standardizing tests gives them less opportunities, not more. Thank you.
Alrighty, thank you, Mubarak, for your wonderful speech. I'd now like to call upon the first speaker of the negative bench to respond to affirmative. Here.
Hi, can I be heard okay?
Yep, you're good.
Wicked. I'm going to start my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Assalamu alaikum, and a very good afternoon to everyone. It's very lovely to see you from a very cold London at the moment. And I'm here representing kind of negative. Before we do anything, let's clarify what this debate is about. Because this debate is not about the existence of local government, which we concede to be a very good thing and have a variety of benefits. And we agree with Mubarak's characterization that situations such as the IAUM international student route should never have occurred. We also recognize that local government, in terms of education, still gets some level of choice as to how the funding is maneuvered, as to exactly individually by school, what area of the curriculum they support teaching. What national government do is provide a regulatory baseline and the ability to provide a clear public good to the population that is the thing that is being debated in this debate. And I think it's really important you bear that in mind throughout the course of my speech, because I'm going to argue to you two things. First, I'm going to argue that this premise set out by government fundamentally misaligns what a public good is in making it no longer non-excludable and non-rivalrous, to the point where if you are an individual who grows up outside of a capital city, it becomes infinitely harder for you to get better educational quality, the disparities are increased, and the politicization is made worse of education. Second, we're going to argue this makes worse educational outcomes by arguing that you get less funding for schools in the communities that really need them most, and a big brain drain away from the areas and communities that really need development of their schooling systems to ones that have the best schooling systems to begin with, which means that KL schools get better and better funded and better policy, but everyone else moves in that direction. Responses. I think just two things very quickly from a very nice speech from Abaya. I think the first is on accountability. They claim that local government are easier to hold to account. I would argue also have lots of problems holding out a government to account on a local level, for the reason that they turn around and say, guys, look, we were hamstrung by the amount of money we were given by this national government, or by the fact that the national government still owns the English and maths curriculum as they so support, such that we don't have any power in controlling that. There's not much we can really do. And this happens vote cycle over vote cycle. If you think about it, it's exactly the same way as policing, where they say police statistics, look, that's something we are held to account for by a big local government and not something we can do about. I think accountability probably suffers both ways. I think it's marginally better on a national side, at the point where you have clear ministries. For example, in the United Kingdom, we have a ministry for education, a ministry for higher education, which means that you have a clearer recourse structure of going to your minister if there are problems, or of being able to have things such as executive committees and discussing the types of issues faced in those places. That doesn't happen in localized communities because simply there isn't enough individuals or funding. The second thing to say is that they argue that it's harder to make government policy in a world in which you have a more diverse, more kind of populous area. I want to be clear here. I mean, the United Kingdom has 69 million people living in it, and does a good job of this because the way in which national governments set out education is they give options to kids. They say, look, here are a variety of things that are standardized that you can learn about. You can learn about the Tudors in history, or the Cold War, or Islamic empires, any of those things that you so wish. So there are options for schools to choose based upon what fits that local school best. We were able to have that flexibility under our side. But the second thing to say is that presumably in a situation in which you have lots of different types of people and you're not looking to offend people, but provide them educational skills, you find the lowest common denominator, right? And you find the basic things everyone needs and everyone agrees on and set those as your curriculum. What proposition have to stand by is massively moving the goalposts here. And here brings my public good argument. And I think the purpose of this argument is, if I'm able to demonstrate to you that education is a public good such that it is non-excludable and non-rivalrous, and this no longer makes it a public good, independent of outcomes and whether this makes education slightly better or slightly worse, we win this debate because it is the government simply not fulfilling its function in a way that it is mandated to do. Let's be very clear. A public good is a good that you and I equally have access to as a citizen of a country. What does that look like? That in some states looks like healthcare, in some states looks like access to the armed forces, such that if your community is invaded, the entire army stands up and defends it. And it looks like other things such as having clean water or any of those kinds of things. They are all things that are made to benefit all people of the country equally. The first reason why this doesn't stand up to the public good test is because of the disparities that it furthers in the educational system, to the point where it makes the educational system no longer excludable to individuals that live in certain communities and cannot move, and rivalrous because it puts communities at rivalry based upon who has the better educational system. This is for two reasons. First, because of the wealth of certain communities, because they have more money to be able to spend on the educational curriculum and all of the things around it, meaning that these disparities are made worse. Note, the majority of the funding in this circumstance would come from local government rather than a national body that divvies up the funding. It also means, importantly, that the national government, even if that weren't the case, would have less control over where the money goes to. Therefore, it becomes much more down to the comprehension of civil servants within your local government communities, as opposed to how good your infrastructure is. The second is a political capital argument. Look, I live in London, and London's very lucky because all of politics exists in London, which means that oftentimes lots of political decisions are only made around London, right? What this means, okay, is in a situation in which now only educational populations are made up by local communities, all of those benefits are entrenched, right? Rather than London also having a mandate to protect Manchester and to protect Birmingham and to protect all these other areas, that means that it goes slightly further and it distributes the capital more fairly. Therefore, this makes it more different and more competitive in this way. The problem here is on the comparative. If you have different qualifications and less money, all of these things mean that there is a lack of notice for smaller communities that therefore get less good opportunities and less access. The second on politicalization, I'm going to argue that under status quo, it is an economic good that is locked off in terms of education. But now, under their side, it becomes a matter for lobbying. Why? One, local authorities have less capacity to turn down things that they also owe a duty to. So, for example, if your local community owes things such as to small businesses or rebuilding after COVID or any of those things, it becomes easier to slash the education pool and amount of money that you have there. Second, they have an interest in certain communities for just pushing together certain projects. The example here is in the United Kingdom, the North has quite a big manufacturing sector. And therefore, why would you bother teaching your kids things such as citizenship or history, where you can just teach them industrial skills to get them in? The third is you're able to politicize what is taught, which means for the 1960s in America, you had the teachings of creationism at the extent of no other alternative, of no other scientific teaching, or of only one religion existing. All of these things mean that fundamentally you get worse quality outcomes because there's less funding, as we'll talk about in our second speech, as well as the inability to claim that these goods are not excludable to individuals that don't fit into those certain communities and not rivalrous to other communities that just have more access through the luck of birth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Josh, for your insightful speech. I'd now like to call upon the second speaker of the affirmative bench to respond to the negative bench. Here.
Am I audible? Okay, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much for Josh for the speech. As someone that lives in Indonesia, which is basically the country with most decentralization of education, I think, in Southeast Asia, I completely agree and understand the concerns that you have of things like disparities between regions and politicization of education. But I think there are several things that need to be noted on why these disparities are things that are not necessarily something that is bad on our side. First is that disparities exist anyway because in opposition, because in the world of opposition, what we would have is representations of the Minister of Education, for instance, in these different regions. So basically, we'll still have possibly, if you don't have enough funding towards these regions anyway, in your side, you don't have that too. But also something that is important is that these things are things that can be negated through a lot of mechanisms. So if we learn from Indonesia, what we have is that the way that we fund areas is we can do affirmative action towards areas that are less privileged. So funds does not come from the community or comes from the particular local region itself, right? Central government in any decentralized system will still have their own ways of funding towards the local governments, and they should still have subsidies towards the local governments. What we argue on our side is the decision making and the amount of power of decision that these governments have, because local governments still get subsidies from the central government, especially the ones that are struggling, such as the policies of general decentralization in Indonesia, and I'm sure in many different countries that have different provinces and different states. So in this case, we think that it is still mitigatable in terms of the availability of resources to make sure that we do not have disparate outcomes between different regions. But the second thing that I'm going to talk about is about the idea of public good, right? Because they said that public good means that you need to have equal access towards everything, like healthcare and like armed forces. But I think that this is actually on our side not a principal argument, right? Because it really then still is contingent towards whether or not there are disparities or not. So I think in answering this burden of public good or not, then opposition needs to argue why you won't create disparities when you have a centralized system. And I think there are many reasons why when you have a centralized system that you will have even more disparity, right? All of the analysis that Mubarak have said about how the central government simply doesn't care about the underprivileged regions, simply do not have more fundings towards them anyway, right? Also of having unsuitable curriculums and unsuitable resources being put towards them. I'm going to talk about that on my positive contribution, but as a response, I don't think that's a principal argument. I think that it is still contingent about whether or not you could be creating like non-disparate education in a centralized system or not, which unfortunately opposition have not told us how. They said that we can simply give options, right? Options of different kinds of standardized curriculums. I think that's different in the case of UK compared to, say, case of Malaysia or the case of Indonesia, because oftentimes, exactly as Mubarak has said, you don't have representation in the central government from these particular regions. So these regions cannot say towards the central government that I need curriculum standardized A or standardized B. Oftentimes they would be neglected, and the standardized curriculums don't have the breadth of options that are necessary for the specific context that these regions have. So in the end, that doesn't answer the questions. And lastly, in terms of politicization, I think the politicization basically are often worse in centralized systems. If you look at systems of Indonesia and systems of Malaysia, the centralized system really focuses on what the central government needs. So things like in disparate regions, what would we focus is in Papua, for instance, in Indonesia would be the extraction of minerals, for instance, or in Malaysia, how the central government have a curriculum very focused on the ideologies of the majority party in Malaysia. Things like that are more likely to happen in the sense that the central government is imposing what the national identity is towards oftentimes very diverse populations and makes the education system actually unsuitable for it. How exactly are these diverse contexts not needed, and we have disparate education in the condition of a centralized system? Oftentimes, different regions have different identities. These identities can be a socioeconomic identity. For instance, there are rural areas that are very focusing on agriculture. Or for instance, there are a rural area that culturally really focuses on their music or on their dance and their traditions. Oftentimes, these regions are left behind in different countries simply because they do not fit the mold of what the central government wants them to be, which is the mold of having an industrialization, for instance. All of this politicization of everyone needs to have development, global development of having more bridges and more roads. Everyone needs to be engineers. Everyone needs to be economists. Are exactly the types of politicization that are making these regions left behind. Because first, you have less participation from these people to education to begin with, because they are feeling that they are not being respected, that they are feeling that this is a different world from how they are raised. Parents feel that they shouldn't send their children to school because it would be useless. They should just continue the family farm, or they should just continue the family artistic group, for instance, and these things. We think that having a more decentralized system means that we create opportunities for these regions to actually build their capacities according to what the specific context that they have. So things like vocational schools that focuses more on agriculture, but still with the basic requirements of general education and things like that. And this creates a much better equal good for everyone, right? Because in the status quo, everyone wants to go to the capital city. Exactly the brain drain that opposition are fearing happens now when everyone wants to join the same type of education to get a job in a corporation in the city and in the end becoming unemployed. But in a world where we have a decentralized education, where everyone can say through teachers' unions, through town hall meetings that are much more accessible in the local level, to say that we want to build a better agriculture for our village. We want to build a better artistic community in our village. These things are more likely to be accommodated. Families and children feel that the education becomes useful because it is true towards their identity. And this means that you get more jobs for these people, you get more development for these people in the end. We are very happy to propose this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilham, for your wonderful speech. I'd now like to call upon the second speaker of the negative bench to respond to the affirmative and therefore close the debate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Alisa, for giving me the floor. So So a bunch of false assumptions and claims have been brought up from the side of proposition bench. Like they are talking about how the government is reluctant to help out the minority community with their education, and they're not recognizing their special needs. And also in the rural communities, the students are not getting the same amount of priorities like the urban students get from the government. Think about the democratic country. Think about the government of the democratic states who have to manage all the vote banks from every single areas of a country, like from the rural areas, like from the minority group of people. And that is how in a democratic state, a particular government or a particular party has to win the election. And in that case, we see that even in Bangladesh, the government actually recognizes the needs of the minority community as well as the needs of the rural areas and also the religious minority people. We see in the Bangladesh, like there are British curriculum education, there is Bangla curriculum education. Also, the government has introduced the madrasa system education, as well as the government has introduced textbooks for the hill tracks students on their own language. So that is how the government ensures the special needs of the students or the special community of people should be heard. And that is how, with the more capacity from the government as well as with the more funding, the government is more accountable here to ensure the needs of all sort of citizens of its states. And that is how in our world, talking about the mandates, like as the state is because of the reciprocal relationship with the citizen and the government, and also as George has introduced, that education is a public good, and that is why the government is more entitled here to give its citizens the basic right in a full and more facilitated way. And that is how in our world we also ensure the quality of education in a broader level. Like think about in the decentralized education, what happens, like the schools in rural authorities or the schools in the remote areas, the people right there are not quietly aware of their own roles and responsibilities in the system, and that is how they are unable to make their responsibilities and make a good education policy for their state or province. And that is how the quality of education get dropped there, and that is how the students of these communities lags behind in a more drastic way than the world of than that of our world. And that is how the students from the rural or remote areas or the minority communities as well lags behind from the students of richer communities or the more privileged group of students. And also, as Josh has already showed you, how actually the teachers and the students as well, it makes a polarization in the education systems, like the richer people and the people from the privileged community, they get some more qualityful education, and the schools who have more money to spend behind education, they get the more qualityful teachers compared to the schools in the rural areas, or compared to the schools and educational institutions in the more less privileged areas. And that is how the education is based upon the financial capability of each local government, and that is how the quality gets dropped, because in the rural areas we see in a very organic way the qualified people don't, since the qualified people has more ambition to their careers as well as their personal life and self-fulfillment. In that case, these people don't tend to get like stay in the rural communities and make the betterment of the education. And that is how in an organic way we introduce discrimination in the education system. Already in the capitalistic society, the education is more based upon to the people who have more access to financial capability and power. These people are the people who gets the more qualified education. Like we see in Bangladesh, the people who have good financial capability, they get into the private universities like North-South universities or BRAC University, and that is how the student get more qualityful education than that of the public universities. And the suffering of the students right there in the public university, and the government is not even quite accountable to them. So that is how the discrimination get introduced to in a broader level. And in this world, the government is not even accountable for that. And that is why the government has the less incentive to reduce the discrimination in the education. We see throughout the evolution of our evolution of the humanity, we have worked towards how we can minimize the discrimination in the education and other public terms of goods for better access to everyone, as well as ensuring equality to every group of people. But in their world, through the decentralization, it's very sugarcoating that in their world, the minority people will get to read in their language, read the textbooks in their language. But what will be the quality of education they will get at the end of the day? Like differences, like Mr. Wasi have talked about how the in a standardized syllabus, the urban area students actually gets more advantage in the same textbook. We don't think in that way. Think about the quantum mechanics introduced in a physics book of a national curriculum. In that case, the teacher who is doing his job in a public school, he will receive the same amount of training from like the person who is getting in one school of an urban area. And that is how the both teacher is more. It is more likely that both of the teachers are equally qualified in the schools of rural areas as well as in the school of urban areas. And that is how with the standardized textbook, the students are getting introduced with the same amount of resources. And that is how at the end of the day, they are making the competition in a more level playing field. And at the end of the day, they can compete in a better way, and in a centralized education, we reduce the discrimination in a broader way, and we're very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariam, for your wonderful speech. With that, I'd now like to open the 10-minute discussion period for the affirmative and negative benches to challenge each other's cases. Negative bench, you may now rebut the affirmative bench's case with your reply speech. You're here.
Thank you very much. And I will point out this has been a very good government case in support of a policy that I think has merits to it, to be clear. I do think that situations such as giving some communities more control might be a good idea sometimes. The problem is it doesn't factor in the following things. The fact that it took Tennessee up until 1967 to stop teaching creationism without any mention of science. The fact that you have independent schools in Ireland telling women that abortion is still not a legitimate thing and not a legitimate choice to ever make. The fact that you still got schools within the United States that will actively racially segregate in terms of this election and are able to go about doing it because local government authorizes it. I think when you view it that sort of way, you realize that actually the idyllic situation, specifically of the second speaker of government, which I think would be an ideal world for government to live in and would be the correct world to do things, isn't the one in which we inhabit at the moment. And actually, that itself is the reason why the public good argument becomes deontological. That becomes non-consequentialist, if you like. The reason is very simple. It is not just about the disparities that may or may not exist under status quo. I think they exist to a lesser degree than government want to make out. But I think it's more to the point of when you actively condemn these local communities to whatever their identities are and say, look, we aren't going to touch them anymore. Look, we cannot police them. Look, we are in a situation where actually you guys can do whatever you want. Oh, what does that look like? I mean, it looks like the enhancement of all of those socially negative views that I said, but also it looks like things such as, even in their best case scenario, where I think the really good example mentioned is the farming communities. And actually, it's really good for people who are going to go back and work on a farm to come back with slightly more experience. I think it's two things. The first is, yes, but then they can only ever work on that farm, right? And they are part of a group of individuals who aren't socially mobile. They do not have the elasticity of work that, as they try and refute, individuals who may go to better universities or may go and study something naturally do have, even if they go to the city and find unemployment, because they have other skills that they're able to collaborate in different ways and move in different directions. The second thing to say is that if you really care about farming as much, we're not going to stop people going to higher education for looking at those things. What it is about is getting the prerequisite education so that you're able to engage with the system. That looks like a 14-year-old who is learning the basic literary skills in Malay, or learning the basic numerical skills they need to go about. But in the same way, there also needs to be a requisite understanding of history. There needs to be a requisite understanding of geography to make sure these people are not in a situation where when employers ask them for their skills, they literally do not have them. And it's not one individual in a community. It's an entire community missing them. And I think this is where it comes into the main points of our arguments, which is to say, look, first, in a situation where they claim that subsidies still happen, the problem is it relies on a civil service within a local community that is able to deal with it. Now, I want to note all of the problems that a civil service has in this regard. The first is they have so many interests in their community, whether that be small businesses or COVID or anything in between, that it becomes really hard to designate time to work out education in their strategy in that regard. The second is that they need to know how to properly turn subsidies that they're getting from national government into outcomes for the school. And what they're not able to do sometimes is make very good decisions on that. They don't have a lot of exposure, a lot of understanding. They spend lots of money on a nice new building, you know, in the middle of Bukit Bintang, you know, and then you realize actually that that is not functional because it's really difficult for kids to get into school in those areas in the morning. You realize that actually, you know, there are still other problems in the classrooms that you need to solve and you need money to solve in a way that you just don't have when you have that national government who are able to roll these things out. The second thing to say is you get different weight of qualification. And that is to say, if you came from that excellent school in Dhaka or you came from North-South University, your grade is respected across the country. Whereas when it feels like, yeah, you got like a really good grade, but you only did it because you were part of the rural Asian community that only teaches about said things, that's when all of the entrenchments and the biases these people face get significantly worse. The big problem there is that education, a tool of social mobility and social progress, aimed to be delivered publicly, no longer becomes that. And that is what we've pointed out from opposition. The third thing to say here is on the politicization. Well, I think, interestingly, Second Op makes the correct claim here. That is to say that rural voting, and the fact that there are rural voting blocks, mean that central government have a need to care. What's the comparative? Because second proposition is correct that lots of the political power lies in the capital cities. What is incorrect about is that there is no incentive for these people with all of the power, all of the best schools, all of the mums that are happy to give lots of funding to these schools, to then use that money to subsidize. They never explain why that would happen. Because frankly, as a local government, you already have enough problems and you want to keep all the money that you have. But second, you also lose the ability to call out things such as when curriculums do go wrong, or when curriculums teach things that are actually not giving the skills to the children that they actually need at the end of the day in order to succeed. Because you do not have the basis to do that, whereas national government have more information, more civil servants, more ability to access these things, and economies of scale that means that they get more of them. Let's go into the costs and benefits, because I think here's again where proposition are quite interesting. I think they say, look, there is more convergence to identity, and that is quite good for preserving identities in small places. What it's also good at is locking out any other good teacher coming in from a different community and saying, here is my skills that I want to teach, at the point where it's in a language that they literally cannot speak, such they can't go there, or when the political beliefs of that institution are so far away, they cannot see themselves moving themselves and their families there. But it's also not very good in terms of keeping the rich families in those areas to make those schools better, when there's an active incentive to just move to a larger, nicer community that has more power and has these things already. The second thing to say here is that in the way of preserving identities and keeping accountability happening, note a national government that says we represent a multiplicity of identities is a much better place to do that. The response we've had from Prop is, that's not quite the way in which it works in Malaysia or works in Indonesia. I want to say two things to this. The first is I think that is a reason to put more emphasis in working better together with the national government rather than completely clawing back. Because at the point where you claw back, you're never going to get that level of uniformity. You're never going to get that uniformity, and you're never going to get the respect in that way to make sure that your identity is something that is taught in other communities. And what that's really bad for is if you are an ethnic Chinese community, for example, in a particular part of KL, there will be people in other communities you're simply not able to access with the types of changes that you'd want. The second thing to say under this is, in the same way, we support making sure that national governments are more collaborative. And they will be more collaborative if local communities show their ability to make sure they are working with the system rather than trying to work against it. And it's for that reason alone, that I think a very good proposition case, a very good stab, with quite a difficult argument, unfortunately falls short, despite the best efforts of two fine gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Josh, for your reply speech. Affirmative, you may now rebut the negative bench's case with your reply speech. Hear, hear.
Thank you, Alyssa. Since opposition had 7 minutes, I'm going to assume I have the same. Okay, so firstly, I want to deal with this because I think opposition coming to this and talking about how we might be starting to teach regressive things in rural areas really, really stinks of urban elite arrogance to me. And this is really what I want to tackle today. Because there's this assumption that like, when it's centralized, we teach such amazing things to children that, oh, rural kids could never learn from their local teachers, is something that really needs to be tackled. Opposition came here today and talked about the British curricular system. Well, let me tell you, because I went through that, they quite conveniently had a justification for capitalism in a way that, justified poor people deserving to be poor. Weirdly, growing up in Bengal, I never heard about the Bengal famine caused by the colonial empire of the British system. Those are history that apparently Josh wants us to learn, but we can't, because when it's centralized by the British Empire itself, we can't learn those things. Then they came up and talked about the also benevolent Bangladeshi government and the things that they're doing for the Chittagong people in the Chittagong hill tracts. The same people who the military, along with the Bangladeshi government, literally slaughtered, and we never heard about it growing up because it was inconvenient to put in our central syllabus. These are the central governments that they trust to give us modern progressive education systems that are going to help people along the way. I just don't think that the central governments are as progressive and as nice as these guys somehow trust them to be. I would much rather trust indigenous community leaders to do what is best for their own communities and be able to see, because I just don't think it's true that these people can't be progressive, that they can't do what's best for their communities. We can have minority communities being physicists, being chemists, and so on and so forth. I just don't buy into this lazy characterization of what rural communities look like. So I'm just going to reject that offhand. So that's the first and most important thing I think they pushed in this debate in terms of talking about the quality of education people are going to have. The second reason they said it's not going to be good is because, they're going to be limited because they can't come to the cities and get jobs because that's what we want them to learn. Obviously, I think we've kind of shown that that's not necessarily true. But even if it were, I think it's much better, no? Because what we do now is we teach kids everywhere how to survive the capitalist world in terms of how you would go through a MNC job, right? And how you would survive it. But what's truly interesting is that what ends up happening is everyone just finishes up their education system. Then they all just flock to the capital city, and the vast majority of people end up not having the very jobs that they studied for. And they end up being Uber drivers in their best case scenario, right? Worst case scenario, kids just being unemployed throughout the whole time. The difference is under our world, maybe they would be better off. I'm sure it's limiting in certain sense, but it's a comparative, isn't it? Rather than being unemployed in the main city, I would rather stay where I am and be able to learn, for example, how to innovate and how to take my father's, for example, farming business and make something more meaningful out of it, how to make that sustainable, right? How to tap into the local industries of my area and be able to take it to the next step and be able to create opportunities for myself in that way. Those are the things that vocational local schools could teach children that they could never do in opposition's world, because it's centralized stuff just shoved in to people assuming that it's good for them, but it's not. And the third thing they said, funding. I think I honestly dealt with it in my first speech. I just said, we're going to use the same funding system, which is going to distribute it. There was no problem with that. These people will just decide how to use the money. I think that was the only difference. I just don't think the funding stuff from opposition makes any difference. Our policy was not to say that local communities need to come up with their own money to do this. Cool. But you know what is even more important than this? What's more important is not that you have the money, but what you do with it. And here is where I think, talking about what happens when people get the money, right? So when ministers get the money and are deciding to allocate, this is where a lot of elements of corruption can come in, right? Because what is the difference here? When your local leader is the one having the access to that money, it is far easier to hold them to account. What did the opposition come up in here and say? They said, but they can give excuses like the central government is controlling me and so on and so forth. But you know what? At the very least, these people can be directly interrogated. These people can be questioned at a town hall meeting, for example. These people are accessible to you. You can stop them and question them. What was their alternative? Their alternative was, but guys, ministries exist. I don't know the last time someone managed to walk up to a minister in Bangladesh and was like, hey, you know what, you need to change your ways. Like, that's not, like, I don't know, like, I think Saima is like the most positive person in the world to be here, coming here talking about the democratic structures of Bangladeshi government. Like, I'm sorry, I don't share the same positivity about our country, but I just don't think those guys are in any way accountable when people who are protesting are actually shot dead on the streets. That doesn't happen with local politicians. You have a sense of safety to be able to hold them to account. Even the British system, what are you talking about? Like the British ministry that Josh talked about, we're literally having Boris Johnson like blatantly like disregarding all COVID rules and the police refusing to take action against him because he's a powerful politician. The truth is the guy making the decisions for you needs to be local, needs to be someone who is not so powerful that you can't hold into account. And that's the big difference, because these are the people that we can hold into account in our world that they simply couldn't in theirs. And that was the most important thing. But you know what? Even if they ended up saying like, oh, we need to give these education systems to these kids, what I would say is when you have localized education systems where you can teach local languages, by the way, don't let them get away with saying like, oh, we can give them options. You can't functionally just say that like you can learn IBAN in any school in Malaysia because you just can't get that many teachers to perform in every school across the board, right? So it needs to be specialized. It can only happen in remote areas, right? So it can't happen under a centralized system. But even if we have less good education, the truth is, when it is catered to communities, when it is vocational schools, for example, and kids can see that it's okay for me not to engage in child labor, for example, a parent deciding that my child can go to a school and learn carpentry and in a couple of years can return to me a lot more, that's a better reason for them to send their kids to school. When a lot of people who are, even if they're like, they culturally motivated, they say, okay, if my kid goes to the school, at least they will learn local traditions and religions and so on and so forth. That's still fine, because those are reasons why a lot more parents will now send their kids to school as opposed to sending them off to do work for the family to earn money. So at least on our model, we have ways in which we are actually getting local communities to build their trust in the education system, to send their kids to school. And like, I don't think our education system will be worse. I think it will be better. But even if it was worse, I will still take it, because more kids going to school is a public good we propose.
I'd like to thank both benches for their speeches throughout the debate, as well as throughout this discussion when they were rebutting each other's cases. Now that the debate is over, I'd now like to open the floor to the audience for any questions regarding the debate. Again, do remember to include which speaker you'd like to address your question to in order to avoid any confusion in the discussion. If you don't have any specific speaker that you'd like to address your question to, you are welcome to address it to a whole bench instead. Okay, so I'm gonna take like a minute to check for questions, yeah? Okay, so the first question I have is for the affirmative bench. The question is, wouldn't decentralizing the education system create further gaps between the rural and urban areas? Either of you can answer, or both of you can answer.
Ilham, do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first?
I go first. I think the first thing is that exactly as Mubarak has said, that decentralization doesn't mean that you have disparate funding. The funding would be the same. Most likely decentralization means that you have more power in using that funding. So what do you do after you get that funding? But furthermore, there's not really a priori objective way to see if it is something that is good or not, because in affirmative side, we would say that how a fund is used would be best judged in terms of its quality by the community itself, in terms of what are the values that they hold, what are the problems that are important for them. So in that sense, we think that as long as we equip them with the abilities and trainings of making sure that the curriculums are accommodative towards the needs of the communities, it may look different, it may look like it is worse, but oftentimes it is actually suitable towards the way of life and the necessities of the communities themselves in the rural areas. Maybe Mubarak want to add to that?
Yeah, so I think that the first thing to think is like, when it is centralized, it's not as if there's no difference. There's a huge difference in terms of like, there's a privilege gap, right? Like, so urban kids often have access to what do you call it, better teachers, tutoring, and all this kind of stuff that like kids from rural backgrounds don't often get. So I think there's already a gap now, and the gap is really, really obvious when it's the same system. One of the things that I want to say is that I think there are a couple of things, which is that number one, I think, you know, people following different education systems, sometimes people make a bigger deal out of it than it is. Like universities accept students from many different systems around the world quite often and are able to convert those systems fairly effectively, which I think is doable. But I think that maybe it's my developing country background, but I do think that even if like there's some kind of a difference, we really need to start thinking a little bit more realistically as opposed to aspirationally in terms of like just push vocational schools to kids, like those, if that's what benefits them. Sometimes I feel like, you know, we're just too hesitant to make this difference, whereas I think that might be what's needed for those communities sometimes. Like create a night school for street kids, right? Like just do that, like as opposed to like trying to force them to stop working in the morning. Those are things that are more effective and actually gets more results out than trying to forcefully get them to go to the exact same education system as everyone else. Yeah.
Thank you for your answers. This is also a question for the affirmative bench. The affirmative leader mentioned that local authorities are not accountable because of less funding. The question is, why doesn't the government just fund local communities better so that way they can essentially work better or be motivated to work better?
Sorry, could I hear the question again? I didn't get it.
Okay, sorry. The affirmative leader had mentioned that local authorities are not accountable because of less funding. The question is, why doesn't the central government, so the overall government, why doesn't the central government just fund local communities better so that way the local communities can serve their communities better?
Do you want me to clarify? Because I think there might be a misunderstanding in terms of the question, because I don't think I claim that they're less accountable because they have less funding. In fact, I want what this person said, which is that they get more funding and then they get to make their own decisions in terms of how to use that money. Okay, because it said affirmative, so I was a bit.
Sorry.
Question is for Josh.
Sorry, I just got a message. That was for Josh.
Okay, negative. Okay, go ahead.
Josh, did you hear the question?
Yes, I heard the question loud and clear.
No, I'm so sorry.
This is a good question.
Okay.
Look, I think the first thing to say that I think Proposition will probably agree with as well is that this debate, you know, in a world in which we could get more funding from national governments to local governments, that sounds like a good thing on either side. I think the claim that we are running more in terms of the funding argument is simply this, right? If you're a national government, you set a budget. So, for example, the chancellor will set a budget and he'll say, "Look, here's how we want to divide our funds this year." Okay, and a certain proportion of this will be for education, and then it's the job of the Ministry for Education to then impose that not just kind of within certain communities, but across the entire way, and to have those conversations with local communities and with local mayors, etc., to work out what the best way is to go about spending, and then they will implement that spending. Where lots of projects are owned by central government, but two, they have a clear line of transparency going all the way down. I think then the question of, could we not just give more money to local governments is an interesting question. I think the first thing that we've tried to prove in this debate, which I think is to some degree true, is that there is no incentive for a local capital city that has all the money they want to then allocate some of that money to another community, especially if they have all the political power and they claim, look, all the Mubarads and the Mifzals and the Siddiqs all came from our community, right? So we're able to claim all the benefits of those, whereas you guys are just rural and you can do your own thing. I think it's not necessarily a very nice characterization, but annoyingly, it seems to be the way in which a lot of these countries work, specifically in Western Europe. I think then the second question is, what we try to explain as well is that rural communities, say they had more money, right? They still have a bunch of people that can all directly go to their house and be like, "Hi, I am a local business and I need more money." Or, "Hi, I am, a science community and I need more money." And all of them have kind of, in the exact way that Mubarak explained brilliantly, that connection to the local government, which means that they can ask those questions. But what it also means is there is like an increased amount of lobbying. There is an increased amount of people being like, hey, but I want this thing, but I want that thing. And there's more people fighting for the portion of the pie. So it makes getting educational policy, and importantly, getting the right educational policy, quite difficult. So I hope that answers your question, but I think it's a really, really astute question, and definitely something both sides try to grapple with in this debate. So thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Okay, I double checked, and I am sure that this question is also for the negative bench. They had asked, what if authorities become biased or prejudiced to certain communities? How do we ensure that there won't be any injustice in the community when there is a lack of representation that is, acknowledging the existence of these communities? Either Miriam or Josh may answer this question, or both.
Miriam, do you want?
Yeah, I'm going first. So in the democratic states, in most cases, like the community who has the most historical redresses or historical, what should I say, in the community, like in a state, if there is more than one community who have different languages or who have different cultures, in that case, if the government is good enough, in that case, the government actually does itself, like preserving the heritage or just addressing all the communities together. If not, the government is authoritarian or not like the one like Bangladesh. But in these cases, like I said in my speech as well, to ensuring the vote banks, the government tries to address all the communities and keep all the communities' needs and their ensure their rights in their election mandates. So that is how the government tries to design their education policy as well, and that is how actually it serves the facilities or the rights of all parties involved, because like all countries are accountable to the international community as well. Like they have to ensure to the UN that we are preserving the rights of minority community. And because of the social media and because of much more opportunities of making discourses, I think for this reason, actually the problems of even from the remote areas or unprivileged areas, these sort of things are also discussed in social media platforms. And that is how issues are addressed and recognized, and the government in some cases compelled to take action for these sort of unprivileged groups, even if the government is not willing to. So I think this is my opinion, and from my experiences, I have seen the government to act like this. Thanks.
I suppose only one thing to add, which is taking myself out of the debate for a second. I do think Mubarak's correct. Like, I do think this is just something that is true either way. There is always going to be bias to the places where the political centers are, where the majority of the politicians are from. And it's really regrettable that is. And I think almost one of the questions of this debate is, how do we go about addressing that bias? Do we say, right, this bias exists, so what we're going to do is do our own thing? And I think Second Prop in particular was really good at explaining the benefits of acting in that way. Or do you do what we say and say, actually, we want to do a little bit more work to try and get better representation in those communities by working together, by giving it a little bit more time and trying to get more representatives from kind of these minority groups into parliament or whatever else, such that the education system becomes slightly better. So I, again, think it's one of the big questions of the debate, but otherwise Miriam is entirely correct that, these kind of situations really do become quite difficult in a situation where, you have that isolation of those communities. So, yeah.
Thank you, Negative Bench. I just saw in the Zoom chat just now, Brother Muhammad Abdul Latif is asking, my question is, won't too much decentralization lead to national disunity, like madrasas versus national schools?
Ilham, do you want to go?
I think I can go first. do you agree that some disunity exists, like in terms of national and madrasah school, but do you realize that this debate also happens in a national level, in a centralized level? So like if you have like Josh said, the pie is even more in contention if you're talking about a centralized system. But if it's a local system, means that maybe an area would be much more religious. So there's less debate about whether or not you should prioritize madrasah or whether or not you should prioritize like general schools, right? But if you have this debate and you have this disunity of systems in a centralized system and have this debate in the central parliament where there are so many different opinions about what kind of education is the best for the whole country, most likely disunity will happen. But if you small it down to local places where there are already characteristics of these local places that are more able to be discerned whether or not this community needs what kind of education and therefore which needs more funding, I think then the possibility of disunity becomes smaller because everyone already has their equal pies, and how it is divided to different systems would be according towards the preference of this particular region. So it doesn't create disunity. Maybe Mark want to add on that?
Yeah, sure. Latif Bhai, thank you for the question. Just taking myself out of the debate, I think that he's using an example that is very inconvenient for me. So just it's true that the madrasa education system, especially I think that a lot of the foreign funding that has come in has kind of been a problem in Bangladesh. I would say a couple of things. I think maybe you are correct in a way in that, especially if a country is relatively homogeneous, you might be correct, just taking myself out of the debate, like to make things as unified as possible. But I'm in general a little bit skeptical of pushing for enforced and forced unity, especially given the vast majority of countries tend not to be so homogeneous. And in that context, often the forcing of the unity comes at a great expense that I'm not sure I'm comfortable with. I think Ilham knows, can maybe even illuminate us, like Indonesia had one of those projects of like forced unity, and even if you say that there are some benefits out of it, I don't think anyone can say that the process was in any way humane. So I just think that trying to force communities to be the same can often lead to really negative consequences and can is very unfair to minority communities in general, but maybe in a Bangladeshi context, you are correct, especially for homogeneous communities, maybe a little bit pushing of a more unified syllabus would have been helpful, as opposed to letting foreign influence in madrasas and the education system that we have allowed. Yeah.
Thank you, Affirmative Bench. I have one more question for the Affirmative Bench as well from Hazik of UPM. He is asking, how do we keep the delegation of sources, missions, and objectives towards local authorities efficient in order to reach the standards set by the government later? Because regarding feedback and progress, it all does come down to the government, so that way they can proportionately allocate those resources in the next year or 10 years or so.
Sorry, Alisa, but it's to opposition, so I don't.
Really? Oh my God, I'm so sorry.
Negative.
Did you hear what I said? You can also check the chat as well.
Yeah, I saw that in the chat. I was like, oh, that sounds like a great question, Mubarak. I think he explained that one. No, good question. How do we keep it efficient? So I think the first thing to say is that often national governments will have smaller bodies that they will do things through. That might be through specific educational bodies. So they have some in the UK that will deal with for example, we have this board called Ofsted that go around all the different schools in the UK and just check that they're teaching the right thing and that the kids are going fine. So it's through government agencies like that. It's also through, being able to raise those kind of questions to your local MP and your MP then reporting that up. So you still have that recourse structure. And I think almost that explanation would have been quite useful, because a lot of the stuff that Mubarak elucidated in terms of just being able to have a direct linkage with your kind of education person within your local community. Well, you don't have a specific education person, who's your MP, but you do have one that is a representative that can then come to Parliament and discuss those things. I think the third thing as well is I do think that there is an element that at the moment there is some power within local bodies, right? And I just want to break away from this characterization that their side is like, national governments have nothing to do. It's all local governments and it's terrible. And our side is, local governments do absolutely nothing. National government make all decisions. The answer is, in the real world, dependent on your country, it's in that in-between area, right? Where in the UK, probably a bit more national-sided. In Indonesia, I think fair to say from what Ilham was saying, a little bit more on the kind of community focus. And, and I think what to keep in mind there is that I think efficiency becomes a really good question, but a question that different systems will have different ways for kind of making flexibility for. So I think it very much varies country upon country, but it's an important priority for all governments to talk through. And I think that was just my experience of the British government, how they go about it. But Maureen, just kind of anything to add in terms of Bangladesh or any of your thoughts?
Sorry, did Josh ask me something?
Not you, to my partner.
Okay, makes more sense.
Okay. So what I've seen in Bangladesh, like when the government itself puts education in its first priority, like enforcing a strict accountability system, and that is how it can question, like Josh has said, that keeping the MPs into question, and that is how, when the first priority of the government is to ensure qualityful education, and that is how it creates a pressure upon the local delegates in the parliament as well, and that is how they needs to give the answers to the state government, that how much they have prospered in terms of the quality of the education, like how many people have entered into the public services, like jobs in public services, or in how many social entrepreneurs they could have produce in their area. So that is how, by setting up specific standards to measure the quality of education and ensured quality of education, that is how the government can delegate, make the efficient delegation and utilization of resources, and as well as ensuring the quality of education. And secondly, like we see, when the government gives budget to local members of parliaments, like at first they see the previous historical records, that how much infrastructural development the specific member of the parliament could do with the budget it has been allocated in their areas. So that is how I think, in also in terms of education, these question and answering system, these accountability mechanism can bring in some positive changes in each and specific areas of the state, and ensure the quality of education. Yeah.
Thank you, Mariam. I have one more question for the negative bench. It's kind of long. Central control over education policy has proven to disregard the disadvantaged communities, i.e. kids without documents, which continuously put them in the same cycle. So like, constantly moving around and stuff like that. How would negative respond to this?
Oh, that is a great question. So I think the parallel that I'll draw very quickly is kind of sanctuary cities in the United States, so there are some cities in the United States that you're able to go into with limited documentation and kind of receive the benefits of police services, of healthcare, of these kinds of things. I think the way in which we'd consider those is definitely, look, these are good things, and in a world in which they didn't exist, they'd cause a lot more problems. But it's something that national government en masse need to be more alive to. I think the reason for this is, if you think about it, if there are kids in a local community that don't go to school, a few of them, that is a problem for the local government, but it's also a problem for the national government, right? Because presumably they're not the only ones, and that's not the only community in which that's happening. So there are bigger fixes that are needed, either to find these people kind of education systems that they can work through, whatever else. I would say the second group of people that I would think about when kind of going through this, we have a traveling community in the United Kingdom that isn't, massively huge, but do go to different parts of the country and will spend lots of time in kind of different parts. And what you need in those kind of situations, I think, is the ability to make sure that national government creates kind of the common denominator at the bottom. That means that individuals are able to access basic schooling things, right? And aren't locked out of certain communities, but can go from one school to another fairly easily, rather than going from one school to another and being like, in this mining community, I was learning all about, different mines, whereas in this community, I'm learning about hardcore algebra. This is very different. And I think all about making sure that national government knows what the kinds of issues are that they can then go back either with the help of local communities or to create national policy that is able to incorporate those groups of people that would otherwise be left behind. Because I do think if you leave it up to local communities, I think it's probably a point on proposition they do it better. But I think they do it better for those specific people, whereas for kind of helping people that might fit into that broad umbrella of people who don't go to school all the time or people who move around the country, those are the kind of things that I think are something that national governments need to work on and need national government backing in order to make real progress.
Mariam, would you like to expand upon what Josh had mentioned?
No, I think what George has said, that is quite like that. I'd add things like quite the same. So I think that's fine.
In that case, I'd like to thank both of the benches, or all the speakers individually, as well as the benches collectively, for the arguments on this issue and answering all the questions that we had. There were so many, I got confused. I'm so sorry for that. And with that, we hope that you had learned a lot about how education can be affected by central governing bodies and the possible consequences that may come from it, whether or not any kind of government, any governing body decides to centralize or decentralize their education system. With that, I'd now like to adjourn this session so that we may continue to the closing ceremony of the 2021 International Conference on Student Development in Higher Education. Thank you. Also, do remember to fill out the attendance form as posted in the chat box while we prep for these slides and backdrop to be prepared. Thank you, speakers, again for coming around. We really appreciate you guys coming. Also for Josh, because you're all the way in London and stuff, and the time difference is kind of nuts. And Mubarak, because you're in Qatar.
Yeah, I was about to say, what is this discrimination? I'm also far away. Okay.
I'll have you know, it is 2 o'clock in the afternoon here, but still as grey and dark as it is, I imagine, in KL.
Ilham, you're in Indonesia, right?
Yeah.
I see. Mariam, are you in Bangladesh? You're in Bangladesh right now, right?
Yes.
Okay, so we're countries, I see. Cool. And it feels so weird being in Malaysia and then we're all here and it feels like we're all in the same place, but we're not. But yeah, thank you guys for coming around.
Thank you, everyone.
alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and I bid a good evening to the Rector of IIUM, Professor Emeritus Tan Sri Dato Zulkifli bin Abdul Razak, Deputy Rector Dr. Zulkifli Hassan, Director from the Holistic Student Division of the Ministry of Higher Education, Associate Professor Dr. Muhammad Suziran bin Muhammad Jamil, and our Supervisor, Madam Mizan binti Muhammad. This ceremony marks the end of the 2021 International Conference on Student Development in Higher Education. Alhamdulillah, our conference has successfully comprised of 6 sessions. In our first session, we had a discussion titled Higher Learning Education, a New Narrative, where Professor Emeritus Tan Sri Dato Zulkifli Abdul Razak, Afika Zulkifli, and Davina Devarajan had discussed the importance of integrating a more cooperative relationship between students and their leaders in order to promote youth empowerment and activism. In our second session, we had Professor Suhail Inayatullah express his wisdom in a special lecture titled In the Living Room, Learning and Working in the Transition, where we learned about the importance of having an adaptable and flexible learning culture to cater to the changes in our students' needs throughout each generation. In our fourth session, we had a special forum with Abraham Hino, Samuel Jose, Idayu Mumtaz, and Omid Ghalamzadeh Nasrabadi about their experiences in student leadership. And last but not least, for our fifth and sixth sessions, as what had just happened just now, we had 2 presidential debates comprising issues about government involvement in their education systems and the extent that their influences could have on students. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Mior Alif to announce the results of the third session that we had yesterday, the poster competition. Please welcome.
Thank you very much, Sister Lisa. Assalamualaikum and good evening to all. I think you heard yesterday we had a vibrant session with the contestants of the ICSDHE 2021 poster competition. The contestants, each of them had the opportunity to present their posters as well as address questions from a panel of judges. The judging criteria included assessments of the aesthetics, the content, and the presentation of the posters respectively. Before I announce the results, I would like to congratulate, of course, all participants for their valiant efforts. I think it was a strong showing. And of course, the esteemed panel of judges for their time and for their expertise. So the results of the competition are as follows. In third place, with the poster titled Higher Education for Persons with Disabilities by Nur Evi Viani, Muhammad Azlan, Nur Azika binti Mustaza, Nur Firzana binti Muhammad Supi, Siti Aisha binti Muhammad Khair. In third place, with this poster titled Higher Education for Persons with Disabilities. In second place, with the poster title Reviving Student Unionism in Malaysia, we have, I think, Brother Darwish Roslan and Sister Thira Abdullah. And in first place, we have Brother Said Muhammad Fahmi bin Said Nasruddin with his poster titled Animal Therapy for a Holistic Student Wellness by himself. Congratulations to all 3 of them, all 3 winners. In third place, Higher Education for Persons with Disabilities. In second place, Reviving Student Unionism in Malaysia. And in first place, our winner for the ICSDHE 2021 poster competition, we have Animal Therapy for Holistic Student Wellness by Brother Syed Muhammad Fahmi bin Syed Nazaruddin. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Mior, for announcing the results of the poster competition. I would now like to invite, I would now like to invite Oh no, I lost my place. Okay, I'm so sorry. Thank you, Dr. Mior, for announcing the results of the poster competition. With that, I'd now like to invite Associate Professor Zulkifli Hassan. Are you in the room?
Assalamu alaikum. Yes.
Thank you, Professor, for coming around. I invite you to give a closing speech for our conference. Please welcome.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Thank you very much to Sister Alisa Muhammad, representative of Holistic Student Division, Ministry of Higher Education, Madam Mizan Muhammad, Director of International Islamic University World Debate and Oratory Center, representative of Baitul Amanah, IM Student Union, Persatuan Pelajar Indonesia Malaysia, IIUM, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. All praises be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the most gracious and the most merciful. Peace and blessing be upon our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Let us be grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for his blessing that allowed us to gather and join these international leaders conventions. First and foremost, I would like to express my gratitude for the wonderful opportunity to deliver these closing remarks on behalf of the International Islamic University Malaysia. Allow me to record our deepest appreciation to everyone for joining the International Student Leaders Convention, being part of the inaugural International Conference on Student Development in Higher Education 2021. Alhamdulillah, I'm very happy, I'm very delighted to note that the good turnout in these International Student Leaders Conventions and ICSDHE. More than 700 viewers watch our live streaming and more than 100 participants in Zoom from various parts of the world. I truly appreciate your taking time out to attend this important program because what we deliberate in the conference is crucial and important step in the development and improvement of the students in higher education. Congratulations to IIUM World Debate and Oratory Center for pulling it together with the young student leaders in organizing these important programs. I'm sure your efforts and commitment have set a milestone in redefining youth leadership and activism specifically and student development in general. Congratulations and almost thanks to the Holistic Student Division, Ministry of Higher Education for the wonderful support and make this event possible. And our heartfelt gratitude to our amazing collaborator, Baitul Amanah, including our strategic partner, IM Student Unions and Persatuan Pelajar Indonesia Malaysia for successfully organizing the International Conference on Student Development in Higher Education. I believe during these 2 days, all of us have obtained fruitful discussions, and I know that there have been many interesting and useful sessions, keynote address, including the amazing, like tonight, Youth Presidential Debate. I believe many good experiences have been shared and good lessons learned. I would like to thank all presenters, debaters, and participants who have joined this conference. Inshallah, we are planning to consider organizing the International Conference Student Development Higher Education as annual event, make dua, so that we may continue our endeavors in evoking student activism and empowerment in higher education. Brothers and sisters, allow me to share a certain context of my reflections. International Conference Student Development and Higher Education have not come at a much better time, a time where higher education is headed to a change, and higher education sector is going through such a great challenge with the developments taking place in the world, with the impact of the Industrial Revolution 4.0, the climate change, and then followed by the COVID-19 pandemic. The world of education need to change and adapt rapidly. So when we started planning for this conference, when we had a discussions with the director of IWANT, we had a clear intention that through this program, through this conference, we would like to forward a new narrative. We would like to create a new narrative as to how student development in higher education be seen. Based on the observation, when universities plan changes and transformations, the students' affairs do not get the attention and emphasis they deserve. So the role of student affairs is understood in a narrow context, concentrating on organizing and managing student activities, including controlling the financial aspects and the program approval. So this situation raised questions to the need to rebrand and give a new perspective or narrative to student affairs. So brothers and sisters, students are the hope of the future. So the student development is not only about engaging the students, but what is more important, empowering them. Student development must provide support to unleash and unlock the potential of students. And in preparing our talents to become excellent and a balanced persons, students must start with activism. Students must start with activism because activism is very, very important and very, very significant. The study shows that majority of student activists expected to continue activism beyond university and incorporate it into their careers. As such, the student activism must be holistic, namely intellectual, educational, and social, and the scope of activism must be wide and diverse enough not only to focus on certain areas such as intellectual, but also must be balanced with the educational and social responsibilities towards communities. In this regard, the fundamental purpose of education is to educate the students towards serving the societies in pursuit of the knowledge. The university must be close to the community, and the students must be involved with the community. Student development that only revolve around campus activity without involving the outside community will not be able to produce virtuous people and contribute to the society. I will not prolong my speech, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. I hope you enjoyed the conference. I hope you enjoyed the convention. It is hoped that the insight and experiences shared by our speakers, by our debaters, by our keynote speakers will give you some useful guidance and interventions in mapping your futures. Listening to the discussions, listening to the debates that happened throughout yesterday and today, give me hope that the future, inshallah, is in good hands. But the world needs more young students and youth to participate and brave out the challenges. Once again, I take this opportunity to express my heartfelt appreciations and deepest gratitude to IIM World Debate and Oratory Center, as well as the Holistic Student Divisions of Ministry of Higher Education Malaysia for supporting this event, and our amazing collaborator, Baitul Amanah, thank you so much, and our strategic partner, IIM Student Union and Persatuan Pelajar Indonesia Malaysia, and as well as to our guest speakers, our participants, and everyone involved in making this conference possible and a success. Without your support, this conference will not take place. And last but not least, it is my most ardent hope is that the gathering of minds in this conference, in these international leaders conventions, will be a platform that will gather interest, participations, and support toward improving the student development in higher education. Make dua, may we see each other again in the next editions of International Conference on Student Development in Higher Educations. Thank you and best wishes. Wabillahi taufiq wa hidayah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you, Associate Professor Zulkifli Hassan, for the inspiring and very motivational closing speech to our conference. Now, ladies and gentlemen, to gain blessings for the entirety of the event, along with the closing ceremony, I would like to invite Muhammad Izzat bin Muhammad to recite the closing dua. Please welcome.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Let us begin with the recitation of Furqan Al-Fatiha. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Allahumma anta rabbuna la ilaha illa anta khalaqtana wa nahnu ibaduka wa nahnu ala ahdika wa wa'dika mastata'na. Na'udhu bika min syarri ma sana'na. Nabu laka bi ni'matika alayna wa nabu bi dhunubina faghfir lana fa innahu la yaghfiru dhunuba illa anta. In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful. All grace is due to Allah, the Almighty. Ya Allah, allow our speech to continue to guide and inspire us with piety. Ya Allah, Ya Rahman, Ya Rahim, continue to give us your blessing after our closing of the International Conference on Student Development in Higher Education. Endow us with all your peace, goodness, and blessing, and make our future endeavors pleasant and successful. Give us strength and show us the right path, such that we may continue to support each other, attain peace and harmony, and open the way to us for opportunities that benefit our nation, country, and the world. Allahumma ja'al jam'ana hadha jam'an marhuma, wa tafarruqana min ba'dihi tafarruqan ma'asuma, wa la taj'alillahumma fina wa la ma'ana, ولا من يتبعون شقيا ولا مطرودا ولا محروما ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل واهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم من النبيين والصديقين والشهداء والصالحين وحسن أولئك رفيقا يا أرحم الراحمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
Ameen, Ameen, Ya Rabbil Alameen. Thank you, Muhammad Izzat, for the beautiful recitation. With that, before we adjourn this session, we'd like to have a short photography session with everyone present today. Do turn on your cameras and smile as wide as you can. As always, the more the merrier. Are we ready for the screenshot? Hello, are we ready for the screenshot?
Okay, Bismillah.
Okay.
May everyone open the camera? Thank you. Okay, for the first page. 1, 2, 3, 4. Thank you. For the second page. 1, 2, 3, 4. Thank you.
All right. Thank you again, ladies and gentlemen, for coming along during this conference and for supporting us and coming all and like spending your time to join us and speaking with all of the keynote speakers, as well as listening to the insights that they have on the issues that we presented. Do remember to fill out the attendance link as posted in the chat box. And with that, take care, stay safe, and have a good night. Thank you again.